The receipt was still warm from the printer when my mother told me, for the third time that month, that money doesn't grow on trees. I was standing in the back office of my bakery, flour still under my fingernails, holding a wire transfer confirmation for $2,500, and I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I didn't know what else to do with my face. My name is Elena. I'm 32 years old, and I own a small bakery called Sweet Dawn, on a corner that used to be a dry cleaner's before I gutted it and rebuilt it with my own hands and a business loan I paid off 2 years early. I had just sent my parents their monthly transfer. I had been sending it, without missing a single month, for 8 years. It started small. A few $100s here and there when my father's hours got cut at the plant. Then it became structured, expected, a line item in my own budget before it was a line item in theirs, $2,500 a month, wired on the 3rd, because that was when my mother said the mortgage was due. I never asked to see the mortgage statement. I never asked much of anything. Asking felt like it would break something that was already barely holding together. My sister Vanessa never sent them $1. She didn't need to. She was the one who got the trip to Cabo for her 30th birthday, the down payment on her condo, the standing invitation to Sunday dinner where she sat at my father's right hand like she'd always been there, because she had. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself love isn't a ledger. I was wrong about that, but it would take me a long time, and one phone call that lasted exactly 47 seconds, to understand exactly how wrong. That morning, the bakery smelled like cardamom and burnt sugar, because I'd been testing a wedding cake recipe for a client, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that I should ask my mother what she thought of the flavor. I didn't. I never got the chance. By the end of that week, I would stop thinking about flavors and start thinking about bank statements, and by the end of that year, I would understand that the family I'd spent 8 years trying to hold up with both hands had never once tried to hold me. But that morning, I still believed we were fine. I still believed if I just gave enough, eventually it would be returned. I had no idea how close I already was to finding out otherwise. 3 weeks before that, I got engaged. Daniel proposed on a Tuesday, which he later admitted was intentional. He didn't want our anniversary tangled up with some manufactured, Instagram-ready date. He wanted an ordinary day to become extraordinary because of what happened inside it, not because of what day it happened to be. That's the kind of man Daniel is. Steady. Unshowy. The kind of man who notices when you're tired before you've said a word, and just starts making the tea. I called my mother that same night, giddy, my hand still shaking slightly from the ring being new on my finger. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said, and I could hear, faintly, a television in the background, and Vanessa's voice saying something I couldn't make out. "We're so happy for you." We. I noticed the word land strangely, the way you notice a floorboard that's slightly softer than the ones around it, without stopping to ask why. "When were you thinking?" she asked. June 15th. Next year. That gives everyone plenty of time. There was a pause, not long, maybe 2 seconds, but long enough that I heard myself fill it before she did. I know that's coming up on Vanessa's birthday season too, but I figured with a year's notice. June 15th should be fine, my mother said, in a tone I would only later learn to recognize as the sound of someone doing math in their head and not liking the answer. "We'll figure it out." I didn't think about that sentence again for months. I should have. Here is something about running a bakery that most people don't think about: you learn to read proof before you can see it. You learn to press 2 fingers into dough and know, from the way it springs back or doesn't, whether it's ready or whether it needs more time, more warmth, more patience than you're currently giving it. You learn that some things cannot be rushed without collapsing later, in the oven, when it's too late to fix them. I did not apply that instinct to my own family. That was my blind spot, and it would cost me almost a decade before I understood it. I believed that if I just kept feeding something, money, patience, forgiveness, it would eventually rise into what I needed it to be. I never asked whether the thing I was feeding actually had the capacity to rise at all. I didn't know that yet, standing in my office with a wire confirmation in my hand and cardamom on my fingers. I only knew that something about my mother's voice on the phone that night had left a small, cold spot in my chest that the rest of the day's warmth never quite reached. I went back to my cake. I told myself it was nothing. It was not nothing. But I wouldn't understand what it actually was until a phone call, 47 seconds long, 6 months later, and even then, it would take the rest of the year for me to understand what that phone call had actually cost me, and what it would ultimately set free. Sweet Dawn opens at 5:30 in the morning, which means my alarm goes off at 4:15, which means I have spent 8 years of my adult life in a kind of pre-dawn solitude that most people never experience. There is something clarifying about kneading dough while the rest of the city sleeps. You cannot lie to bread. It tells you exactly what it needs, and if you ignore it, it tells on you later, in the crumb, in the crust, in the way it either holds together or falls apart under its own weight. I wish I'd been half as honest with myself as I was with my sourdough starter. The wedding planning moved forward through the fall in fits and starts, a venue booked in February, a dress fitting in March, invitations designed by a graphic designer friend who gave me a discount because she liked my croissants. Through all of it, my mother's involvement had a strange, thin quality to it, like a coat of icing that hadn't quite set. She asked about colors. She never asked about anything that would have required her to actually show up for something before the day itself. "Have you sent the save the dates?" she asked me in April, over the phone, while I stood at my kitchen island rolling out dough for a client's birthday order. "Sent them last week," I said. "You guys are all set for June 15th. She said. "We'll see." I stopped rolling. "What does that mean?" "Nothing, it just, your sister's been wanting to do something big for her 30th, and June is a busy month for everyone." I remember exactly how the flour felt under my palms in that moment, dry, slightly cool, ordinary, because I was concentrating on it instead of on the sentence my mother had just said, the way you concentrate on a physical task to keep from feeling something else. My sister's 30th wasn't until August. I did the math without meaning to. I filed it away without meaning to. I told myself, again, that it was nothing. That's the shape my denial took, for years. Not blindness, I saw things clearly enough. I simply refused to let myself finish the sentence they implied. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever kept sending money to people who never once asked how you were doing, if you've ever told yourself that love and obligation were the same thing, because untangling them felt like too much work, you already know exactly what those months felt like. You weren't imagining it. You were just choosing not to look at it yet. The transfers continued. $2,500, every third of the month, without fail, since I was 24 years old. I had started them when my father's hours were cut at the plant, back when I was still working 60-hour weeks at someone else's bakery, saving for the loan that would eventually become Sweet Dawn. I kept sending them after I opened my own place, after the loan was paid off, after the business started actually turning a profit, because by then it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the feeling I got when my mother said, "Thank you, sweetheart, we don't know what we'd do without you." That feeling was the real transaction. The money was just the currency I used to buy it. My profession gave me something my parents never accounted for, a spreadsheet mind. Running a bakery on tight margins means tracking every dollar, every ingredient cost, every hour of labor against every sale, because the difference between profit and collapse in a small food business is often a matter of pennies per unit multiplied by volume. I had built, over years, an instinctive habit of logging every significant transfer of money, not out of suspicion, but out of the same discipline that kept my walk-in cooler organized and my inventory accurate. I never thought of it as evidence. I thought of it as bookkeeping. It would become the most important spreadsheet of my life. In May, 6 weeks before the wedding, I drove out to my parents' house for Sunday dinner, the way I did most months. Vanessa was already there when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with our father, laughing at something on her phone, the two of them leaning toward each other in a way that had always felt, to me, like a room I'd never quite been let into. "There she is," my father said, not getting up. He never got up. I used to think that was just his way, a man who showed love through steadiness rather than gesture. I would come to understand it differently. My mother was at the stove, and I went to help her, the way I always did, taking over the vegetables so she could focus on the roast. It was a choreography we'd performed 100 times, and I found something soothing in the repetition of it, the chopping, the low murmur of the television in the other room, the smell of rosemary and garlic filling the kitchen. Vanessa's thinking about doing her 30th big this year, my mother said, not looking up from the roast. A whole weekend thing. Maybe even a small venue. That sounds fun, I said, and meant it. I had no reason yet not to. She was actually thinking mid-June. Before it gets too hot for an outdoor thing. I set down the knife. Mom. My wedding is June 15th. I know, sweetheart. I'm just telling you what she's thinking. Nothing's decided. Something had already tightened in my chest, small and sharp, like a muscle clenching before you even know you're bracing for impact. I didn't say anything else about it. I picked the knife back up and kept chopping, because it was easier than asking the question I actually wanted to ask, which was, if it comes down to a choice, which one of us do you choose? I wasn't ready to hear the answer. I told myself I already knew it, and that knowing was enough. It wasn't. Knowing something in the abstract and hearing it stated aloud are two entirely different kinds of pain, and I had several more weeks of ignorance left before I would learn the difference. Daniel noticed something was off with me that whole spring, in the way he noticed everything, quietly, without pushing. You've been somewhere else lately, he said one night, both of us on the couch, my head in his lap while he ran his fingers absently through my hair. Even when you're here, you're not all the way here. I'm just tired. Wedding stuff. Bakery stuff. He didn't argue with me. He just kept running his fingers through my hair, and after a while he said, quietly, you know you don't have to earn your way into this family, right? Mine, I mean. You're already in it. I laughed it off. I told him I knew that. But something about the way he said it, earn your way in, landed somewhere I wasn't ready to examine, because it named a pattern I'd been living inside for so long I'd stopped recognizing it as a pattern at all. I had never once, in 8 years, questioned whether the money I sent my parents was buying me anything. I simply assumed that was what love from a family like mine looked like, transactional, consistent, and never quite enough. I didn't know it yet, but the wedding invitation sitting in a box in my hallway closet, cream cardstock, gold foil lettering, my mother and father's names printed neatly under the RSVP line, were not the worst thing waiting for me that month. June arrived with the particular, frantic energy of final wedding preparations layered on top of the bakery's usual chaos, a wedding season in full swing, orders backed up 3 weeks, my part-time baker out with a torn ligament. I was running on adrenaline and espresso, and I told myself the tightness in my shoulders was just stress, ordinary and explainable, nothing more. My mother called on a Tuesday evening. I was in the walk-in cooler, taking inventory, my breath fogging slightly in the cold, when my phone buzzed against the metal shelving. I almost didn't answer. I wish, some days, that I hadn't. I did answer. And what she told me in the next 47 seconds would end 8 years of a story I had been telling myself about who my family was, and begin the process of discovering who they had actually been all along. The call came at 6:52 p.m. I know the exact time because my phone logs it, and because I have looked at that log more times than I'd like to admit, the way you press on a bruise to check if it still hurts. Hi, sweetheart, my mother said, and there was something rehearsed in her voice, a smoothness that didn't match the topic, whatever it turned out to be. I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear me out before you react. I set down my clipboard. Okay. Your sister's booked the venue for her 30th. It's June 15th. I know that's your date, but the venue only had that one weekend available for the next 4 months, and she's been planning this for so long, and your father and I think it's best if we go to hers. We can celebrate your wedding with you privately another time, whenever works. We just can't be in 2 places at once, and Vanessa needs us there. I stood in the cold of that walk-in cooler, my breath visible in front of me, and I did not say anything for exactly as long as it took me to understand that I had, apparently, already lost. "You're not coming to my wedding," I said. Not a question. I needed to hear the sentence out loud, in my own voice, to believe it was real. "It's not that we're choosing her over you, Elena. It's just timing. It's just how the venue worked out." "Mom. I sent the save the dates in April. I told you the date in October. Vanessa's birthday isn't even until August. She wanted to do it early. Before summer got too busy for everyone." I looked at the shelf in front of me, rows of butter, cream, a case of eggs I'd need to reorder by Thursday, and I felt something inside me go very quiet, the particular quiet that comes right before you understand something you cannot unknow. 47 seconds, I said later, to Daniel, that night, sitting at our kitchen table with my untouched dinner going cold in front of me. I checked the call log. 47 seconds is how long it took her to tell me she wasn't coming to our wedding. Daniel didn't say anything right away. He just reached across the table and took my hand, and let me sit with it, which was exactly what I needed and exactly what my own mother had never once given me. I didn't cry that night, which surprised me. I kept waiting for it, the way you wait for a wave you can see building offshore, and it never quite broke. Instead, I felt something colder and more precise settle into place, a kind of clarity I didn't yet have a name for, but that would, over the coming weeks, reorganize everything I thought I understood about my family. The next morning I opened my banking app before I opened my eyes all the way, still lying in bed, Daniel asleep beside me. I scrolled back through 8 years of transfers, $2,500, on the 3rd of every month, sometimes more when my father's truck needed repairs or when my mother mentioned, offhand, that the property taxes were higher than expected. I had never added it up. I had never let myself add it up, because some part of me understood, even then, that the number would mean something I wasn't ready to face. I opened a spreadsheet. I am a chef by trade, not an accountant, but running a business for 8 years teaches you to build clean columns without thinking about it: date, amount, running total. It took me 40 minutes to compile 8 years of transfers into a single sheet, my coffee going cold beside my laptop, Daniel's breathing steady and unaware in the next room. The total, when the formula finally resolved at the bottom of the column, was $247,500. I sat and looked at that number for a long time. It didn't feel like money. It felt like a sentence I had been writing, one small deposit at a time, without ever reading it back to myself until now. If you've ever done the math on something you'd been avoiding, really sat down and added it up, in dollars or in years or in every time you showed up when they didn't, you know that the number itself isn't really the point. The point is what it makes you finally see about the shape of the whole thing. I didn't tell my mother about the spreadsheet. I didn't tell anyone except Daniel, and even then, I didn't fully explain what I intended to do with it, because I didn't fully know yet myself. I only knew that something in me had shifted, quietly and permanently, the way a foundation settles after years of pressure you couldn't see from the surface. I stopped the automatic transfer the following Monday. It took less than 2 minutes, a few taps in my banking app, a small confirmation screen, no fanfare. I remember expecting to feel guilty. I felt, instead, something closer to relief, immediately followed by a wave of shame at feeling relieved, because what kind of daughter feels relief at withholding help from her own parents? That question would follow me for months. I didn't yet have the language to answer it. I would find that language slowly, through a lawyer friend's offhand comment, through Aunt Carol's careful silences at family gatherings, through my mother-in-law Margaret's steady, undramatic kindness, which showed me, by contrast, exactly how far outside of normal my own family's version of love actually was. 3 days after I stopped the transfer, my father called. He almost never called, it was always my mother who handled communication, my father content to exist in the background of every family conversation, present but never quite participating. Hearing his name on my caller ID felt strange enough that I answered immediately. "Your mother says you stopped sending money," he said, without preamble. I did. A long pause. "Is this because of the wedding thing?" "Dad. You're both not coming to my wedding." What do you think this is because of? Another pause, longer this time, and I could hear him breathing, could picture him in his armchair, the television probably muted but still flickering in the background, the particular posture of a man who had spent 30 years avoiding conflict by simply outwaiting it. She didn't mean it the way it sounded, he said finally. You know how she gets when she's stressed about your sister. I noticed, in that sentence, something I would only fully understand months later. He defended my mother's intent, but he never once defended me. He never said that's not fair to you, or your mother's wrong about this. He offered an explanation for her behavior and no acknowledgement of its cost to me at all. That was the pattern. That had always been the pattern. I simply hadn't had the distance, before now, to see it clearly. I have to go, Dad, I said, and I did, though not for any reason related to the bakery. I needed to be off that call before I said something I couldn't take back, not because it would have been cruel, but because I wasn't ready yet to say it, and I wanted my words, when I finally did say them, to land exactly where I intended. I didn't know it yet, but the spreadsheet sitting open on my laptop wasn't the last piece of evidence I would find that summer. There was something older waiting underneath it, a pattern that stretched back further than my own life, into my grandmother's, and once I found it, I would understand that what had happened to me wasn't an aberration in my family's history. It was a continuation of one. Grief has a strange way of loosening what grief-adjacent people won't say out loud, and it was at my grandmother's memorial gathering, 3 weeks after the phone call, that I first heard something that reframed everything. Grandma Edith had died the previous winter, quietly, in the assisted living facility my mother had chosen for her, a decent place, not luxurious, paid for, I now understood with a cold new clarity, largely through funds that had passed through my mother's hands over the years. We were gathered at Aunt Carol's house afterward, the kind of low-key remembrance that happens months after the funeral itself, when the initial grief has settled into something quieter and people are more willing to talk. I was in the kitchen, helping Aunt Carol arrange a tray of sandwiches, when she said, without looking up from what she was doing, you know, watching what's happening with you and Vanessa, it's like watching your mother and me all over again. I stopped moving. What do you mean? Aunt Carol set down the knife she'd been using and looked at me directly, the way people only do when they've decided, finally, to stop protecting someone who doesn't deserve the protection. Your mother was the one who sent money home, every month, for years, after your grandfather passed. I was the one who got the house, eventually, and the car, and everything, really. Your mother never said a word about it. She just kept sending checks, right up until your grandmother went into the home, and even after that. She never told me that. She wouldn't. It's not a story she likes to tell, because she's not the version of herself in it that she'd want to be. Aunt Carol's voice was careful, precise, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in her head many times without ever expecting to actually have it. I used to think your mother resented me for it. Now I think she just learned the lesson wrong. I think she learned that the person who gives the money is the one who matters least, not most. And I think, without ever meaning to, she's teaching you the same lesson she learned. I stood in that kitchen with a tray of sandwiches in my hands and felt something in my understanding of my entire life quietly, irrevocably shift. My mother wasn't simply cruel. She was repeating something. She had been the Elena of her own generation once, and instead of breaking the pattern when she had the power to, she had recreated it, with me as the one who gave, and Vanessa as the one who received, exactly as she and Aunt Carol had once occupied those same two positions. It didn't excuse anything. But it explained something I hadn't understood before. This wasn't really about me, or even really about Vanessa. It was a script my mother had inherited and never once questioned, running itself out again through her own children, blind to its own repetition. That night, lying awake beside Daniel, I told him what Aunt Carol had said. He was quiet for a while, and then he said something I've carried with me since: understanding why someone does something isn't the same as being obligated to keep absorbing it. I knew he was right. I wasn't ready, yet, to fully act on it. The wedding was 2 weeks away. I had, somewhere in the chaos of caterers and seating charts, made a decision I hadn't fully examined. I was not going to confront my parents before the wedding. I told myself it was because I didn't want to create drama that would overshadow the day itself. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that some small, stubborn part of me still hoped that if I said nothing, if I simply proceeded with grace, my mother might show up anyway, might realize, at the last minute, what she was about to lose, and choose differently. She didn't call. Neither did my father. I sent no invitation reminder, no guilt-laden text. I simply let the date arrive. On June 15th, I married Daniel in a small ceremony at his parents' vineyard property, 60 guests, string lights, the smell of jasmine from Margaret's garden threaded through everything. My father-in-law Owen walked me down the aisle, a role he'd offered gently, weeks earlier, in a conversation so quietly kind it had made me cry harder than anything my own parents had done all year. Margaret cried through the entire ceremony. Daniel's best man made a toast that mentioned, without any bitterness, that some families you're born into and some you build, and that he was glad to watch me build mine. My parents' seats sat empty in the second row, a detail no one mentioned directly but that I felt, all day, like a low hum beneath the music. I did not check my phone once for a message from them. I didn't need to. I already knew there wouldn't be one, and I was, by then, no longer surprised by that knowledge, only sad, in a way that felt clean rather than corrosive, like grief for something I finally understood I had never actually had. If you've ever celebrated the best day of your life with an ache running quietly underneath it, a missing person shaped like someone who should have shown up and didn't, you already know that grief and joy can occupy the same room without canceling each other out. I came close, that day, to telling Margaret about the spreadsheet, about the $247,500, about the 8 years, about all of it. We were alone for a moment in the bridal suite, just the two of us, and she asked, gently, whether I was doing all right, given everyone's absence. I almost told her everything. I almost let the whole thing spill out, right there, still in my dress. I didn't. Something in me held back, not out of shame, but out of a private, stubborn instinct that this evidence wasn't for sharing yet, that it was mine to hold until the moment it would matter most, and that moment wasn't my wedding day. I told Margaret only that my parents had chosen my sister's party over the wedding, and let her draw her own quiet conclusions. She hugged me and said nothing more about it, which was its own kind of mercy. That restraint cost me something. I could have had comfort that day, real comfort, from someone who would have understood immediately and completely. I chose, instead, to carry it alone a little longer. I don't regret it, but I remember exactly what it cost, because dignity, I was learning, sometimes means declining an explanation you're owed, simply because the timing isn't yours to control yet. The months after the wedding passed in a strange, suspended calm. I did not call my parents. They did not call me. Vanessa posted photos from her 30th birthday weekend, a rented lake house, my parents smiling in matching sweatshirts, a banner that read 30 and thriving strung across a deck railing, and I looked at those photos exactly once, on a slow Tuesday afternoon at the bakery, and then I closed the app and did not open it again for weeks. By autumn, Sweet Dawn's 5-year anniversary was approaching, a milestone I'd been planning to celebrate publicly for months. A customer appreciation event with a local food reporter confirmed to attend, the kind of visibility that could meaningfully grow the business. I sent my parents an invitation out of old habit, the last thread of an instinct I hadn't fully cut yet, not really expecting them to come. They RSVP'd yes. Vanessa too. I didn't understand, then, why. I understand now that my mother had heard, through the family grapevine, that a reporter would be there, and that in her mind, an event with public visibility was an opportunity, for reconciliation, for a photo, for a story that could be told about a supportive family standing behind a successful daughter, regardless of whether any of it was true. I still had the spreadsheet. I had never deleted it, never even really revisited it since that first morning, though I knew, with the same instinctive certainty I bring to reading dough, that I hadn't kept it by accident. Some part of me had been holding on to it because some part of me already knew there would come a day I would need it. I didn't know that day was 3 weeks away. I didn't know it would arrive at my own bakery, in front of 60 strangers and a reporter with a notepad, and that by the end of it, my mother's 47-second phone call would finally be answered in full. The anniversary event was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, the bakery decorated with string lights that echoed, unintentionally, the ones at my wedding, small gold bulbs strung across the exposed brick, trays of miniature pastries arranged along the counter, a hand-lettered sign in the window that read 5 years of Sweet Dawn. I had hired 2 extra staff for the day and asked my regular part-time baker to run the register so I could focus on greeting guests. My parents arrived at 2:15, 20 minutes after the event started, my mother in a cream blazer I recognized from Vanessa's birthday photos, my father a half-step behind her as always. Vanessa trailed them both, scrolling her phone, glancing up only when she caught sight of the reporter's notepad near the counter. "This place looks wonderful, sweetheart," my mother said, kissing the air near my cheek, already scanning the room for the reporter. "We're so proud of you." I felt something in my chest go very still, not angry, not yet, just quiet and precise, the way I imagine a surgeon feels in the moment just before the first incision. "Thank you for coming," I said, and meant it more literally than she understood. The reporter, a woman named Priya from the local paper, approached about 20 minutes later, notebook in hand, asking the kind of warm human interest questions reporters ask at events like this. "How did you get started? What's been the hardest part? What does the next 5 years look like?" My mother, standing nearby, inserted herself smoothly into the conversation. "We always knew she had it in her," my mother said, smiling for the small recorder Priya held up. "We've supported her every step of the way." I said nothing for a moment. I felt the weight of the folder I'd tucked into my apron pocket that morning, 8 pages, printed, the spreadsheet's summary page on top, the individual bank statements behind it, the total circled twice in red at the bottom, $247,500. I had told myself, packing that folder that morning, that I might not need it. I had told myself the same thing every day for weeks. I understand now that some part of me had known, all along, exactly what would happen if my mother said something like that within earshot of a reporter, and I had prepared for it anyway, quietly, the way you prep a kitchen for a rush you hope won't come but plan for regardless. "Actually," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected, "I'd like to correct something." The room didn't go silent all at once. It went silent in layers, first the small cluster of customers nearest me, then the ones further back, drawn by the sudden change in tone, until even the espresso machine's hiss seemed like the only sound left in the room. "For 8 years," I said, "I sent my parents $2,500 a month. Every month. That's $247,500. I set the folder on the counter, open to the summary page, the number circled in red plainly visible. I stopped sending it in June, the same week my mother called to tell me, in a phone call that lasted 47 seconds, that she and my father wouldn't be attending my wedding, because my sister had booked a party on the same date. My mother's face went through several expressions in quick succession, confusion, then something like calculation, then a flush of color rising up her neck that I recognized, distantly, as the beginning of panic. "Elena, this isn't the place. You just told a reporter you supported me every step of the way," I said, and I kept my voice level, because I had promised myself, in the weeks of preparing for a moment I hadn't consciously admitted I was preparing for, that I would not raise it. I wanted the actual numbers on record, since we're apparently telling our story publicly today. She told me, much later, what was going through her mind in that exact moment, after enough time had passed that she was finally willing to say it out loud. I saw the folder before I understood what it was, and some part of me already knew, the way you know a storm is close by the way the air changes before the first drop falls. I thought, she wouldn't. Not here. Not in front of people. I had spent 30 years believing that Elena's whole personality was built around not embarrassing anyone, around smoothing things over, around being the one who never made a scene, and for one full second, I actually believed that fact would save me. Then I heard the number out loud, and I understood it wasn't going to. I want to say I felt shame first. I didn't. I felt exposed, which is not the same thing, and it took me weeks afterward to understand the difference. My first thought wasn't I did something wrong. My first thought was now everyone will see it. That tells you something about me that I'm still sitting with. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet, standing at my own counter with a folder open and a reporter's pen frozen mid-sentence. My father said nothing at all, which I had expected. He looked at the folder, then at my mother, then down at his own hands, and he did not defend her, and he did not defend me. He simply became smaller, the way he always did when a room required something from him. Vanessa, standing near the pastry case, said the thing I least expected. "Wait," she said, quietly, not to me but to my mother. $247,000? You told me she barely helped out. I watched my sister's face change in real time, not sympathy for me, not yet, but the specific, disorienting shock of realizing that a story she'd been told about her own family was not the story that had actually happened. She had believed, for years, that I was the distant sister, the one who'd pulled away out of ambition or coldness, while she was the one who stayed close, who showed up, who deserved what she received. She had never once been told what that closeness had actually cost me, in dollars circled twice in red on a piece of paper she was now staring at across the counter. You told her I barely helped out? I asked my mother, and for the first time all day, my voice did shake, just slightly, not from anger but from something closer to disbelief that the story had been rewritten so completely, and for so long, without my knowledge. That's not, I never said barely, I said. My mother's composure, so carefully assembled at the start of the event, was coming apart in visible pieces now, her hands moving in small, uncontrolled gestures, her eyes darting toward the door, toward the reporter, toward anywhere that wasn't my face. This is a private family matter. This isn't appropriate for. You made it public first, I said. At my own bakery. With a reporter standing right there. Priya, to her credit, had lowered her notebook, watching the scene unfold with the careful stillness of someone who understood she was witnessing something she had no right to write down uninvited. Later, she would ask if I wanted any of it on the record. I would tell her no, this wasn't a story for the paper. It was a story I needed my family to hear, once, stated plainly, in a room full of people who could no longer pretend they hadn't heard it too. My mother's voice rose, the panic curdling now into something sharper. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? Humiliating us in front of strangers? I'm not the one who brought up how supportive you've been, I said, quietly. I'm just the one with the receipts. She kept talking for another minute, about ingratitude, about family loyalty, about how money was never supposed to be the point, a claim that landed with a strange, bitter irony given that money was, in that exact moment, the only point that mattered to her, and then, slowly, the room's attention began to do something she hadn't anticipated. Customers who had been strangers to our family history began, quietly, to disengage from her and turn toward me, not with pity but with something closer to recognition, the specific solidarity of people who had, in their own families, met some version of the same story. An older woman near the register, a regular I recognized but didn't know well, said, gently but audibly, "Sounds like your daughter's the one who's been carrying this family for a long time." My mother had no answer for that. It was not the kind of intervention she knew how to counter, because it came from someone with nothing to gain and nothing to lose, and its plainness undid her more than my own accusation had. My father finally spoke, his voice low, almost to himself. "Diane," he said, my mother's name, spoken like a question he'd been avoiding for years, "is that true? 247,000? You knew about the transfers," she snapped at him, and in that single sentence, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped until that moment. He had known. Not the total, perhaps, but the pattern, the years, the consistency of it, and he had simply never asked the question that would have required him to do something about it. He had let it happen the way he let everything happen, passively, at a slight remove, protected by his own refusal to engage. He didn't say anything else. He looked, instead, at Vanessa, and something passed between them that I couldn't fully read, and then he looked back down at his hands, and I understood that whatever reckoning was happening inside him, it would not happen out loud, not today, not in front of a room full of people. "I think," I said, finally, my voice steady again, "it's probably best if you go." My mother stared at me for a long moment, waiting, I think, for me to soften it, to apologize, to do what I had always done, smooth the moment over so everyone else could feel comfortable again. I didn't. I let the silence sit exactly where it landed. Fine, she said, and there was real venom in it now, stripped of all pretense. You'll regret this. You'll regret cutting off the people who raised you. I already regret the 8 years I spent hoping you'd notice, I said. I don't think I'll regret this. They left. My father held the door for my mother without looking at me. Vanessa lingered by the counter for a moment longer, staring at the folder still sitting open beside the register, and then she looked up at me, and for a single, unguarded second, I saw something in her face that looked almost like grief, not for me, I think, but for the version of her own life she'd believed in until about 4 minutes ago. I didn't know, she said, quietly. I know you didn't, I said. And I did know it. That was its own kind of sad, that she'd spent years benefiting from a story that wasn't true, without ever once being curious enough to ask what the real one was. She left without saying anything else. The bakery, slowly, returned to its ordinary sounds, the espresso machine, low conversation, someone's laugh near the pastry case, but nothing in that room, including me, was quite the same as it had been 20 minutes earlier. I didn't hear from my mother for 3 months after the anniversary event. I didn't reach out either. The silence, at first, felt like a wound. By the second month, it had begun, quietly, to feel like something closer to air. Vanessa's life, I learned later, through Aunt Carol, who had appointed herself, gently, as the family's remaining line of honest communication, began unraveling not long after that day. Her fiancé at the time, Tyler, had apparently believed the same version of the family story Vanessa had believed, that she came from a stable, generous household, that the money for the condo down payment and the birthday trips had simply always been there. When he learned, secondhand, the actual shape of where that generosity had come from, a sister quietly bankrolling the family for 8 years while receiving none of it herself, something in his view of Vanessa shifted. They separated within the year. Without my parents' ongoing support, which had thinned considerably once my transfer stopped, Vanessa's finances, built for years on a foundation she'd never had to maintain herself, began to buckle. By spring, she had moved back into my parents' house, into the childhood bedroom she'd once been so eager to leave. I felt no satisfaction hearing this. I want to be honest about that, because I think it would be easy to tell this story as a revenge story, and it was never that, not really. I felt, instead, a kind of sad recognition, the sense of watching a pattern complete itself exactly the way patterns do when no one intervenes to break them. My parents' house went up for sale in the fall, 6 months after the anniversary event. I learned about it through a real estate listing Aunt Carol sent me, not through my mother directly. The mortgage, it turned out, had fallen into arrears almost immediately once my transfer stopped, a detail that told me, with a clarity I hadn't had before, exactly how load-bearing my money had actually been, and how little of it had ever gone toward anything resembling the emergency my mother had originally described to me, years earlier, when the payments began. My father wrote me a letter that winter, an actual letter, handwritten, mailed to the bakery rather than my home, which felt, in its own quiet way, like an admission that he didn't feel entitled to know where I lived anymore. It was 3 paragraphs long. He said he was sorry he'd never once told me he was proud of me, out loud. In 8 years of my sending money he now understood had likely been the only thing keeping their household afloat. He said he understood if I never wanted contact again. He did not defend my mother, and he did not ask for money, and both of those omissions told me more than anything he actually wrote. I wrote back once, a short reply, thanking him for the letter and telling him I needed more time before I could consider anything beyond that. I meant it. I still mean it. Some doors don't need to be slammed to stay closed, they simply need to remain, quietly, unopened, until, or unless, enough real change occurs on the other side of them to justify trying the handle again. My mother never wrote at all. Aunt Carol told me, gently, that she'd been telling relatives a version of the story in which she was the wronged party, humiliated publicly by a daughter who'd never appreciated what she'd been given. I found, to my own surprise, that this no longer had the power to hurt me the way it once would have. I had the spreadsheet. I had the number. I had, more than anything, 8 years of my own memory, clear and unaltered, standing between me and any story someone else wanted to tell about who I actually was. My daughter, Sophia, was born the following spring, 9 months, almost to the day, after that anniversary event, though I promise the timing was coincidence and not metaphor, however tempting the metaphor might be. I held her for the first time in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and, faintly, like the lavender hand cream Margaret had tucked into my hospital bag, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me in the exhausted haze of new motherhood, that I would never once make her earn my love the way I had spent 8 years earning a version of love that turned out, when I finally examined it closely, to have never actually been offered at all. Daniel stood beside the bed, one hand resting lightly on my shoulder, and Margaret and Owen were in the waiting room, having driven 3 hours the moment we called, the way they always showed up for everything, without being asked, without needing a reason beyond simply wanting to be there. That contrast, between the family that had shown up unconditionally and the one that had required an itemized justification for every dollar of care, was not lost on me, lying in that hospital bed with my daughter asleep against my chest. I think, if I'm honest, that was the moment the healing actually started. Not the confrontation at the bakery, though that mattered. Not the silence in the months after, though that mattered too. It was holding Sophia for the first time and understanding, all the way down, exactly what kind of mother I intended to be, and exactly how far that intention now stood from the family I'd grown up inside. Sweet Dawn is doing well. Better than well, honestly. The anniversary event, for all its chaos, generated more local attention than any marketing I'd ever paid for, and the following year I opened a second, smaller location near the university, staffed largely by former culinary students I've made a point of mentoring the way no one in my own family ever mentored me. I think about that sometimes, how the thing I built with my own 2 hands turned out to be sturdier than the family I spent 8 years trying to hold together with money. I am, these days, at peace in a way I didn't expect to be, this soon, this completely. Not happy every single day, grief for a family you never actually had doesn't resolve that cleanly, but peaceful, in the specific sense of no longer waiting for something that was never going to arrive. I no longer check the mailbox hoping for a letter from my mother. I no longer flinch when Vanessa's name appears in my phone, on the rare occasions Aunt Carol forwards some piece of family news I didn't ask for. I have my chosen family instead: Daniel, Sophia, Margaret and Owen, Aunt Carol, who has become, in the aftermath of all this, something closer to the mother figure I always needed, and I have found that a smaller circle, built entirely on people who show up without being asked, holds more warmth than the larger, colder one I spent so many years trying to earn my way into. I sent my last transfer to my parents in June, the same month, coincidentally, as my wedding and the anniversary that followed it. I have not sent one since, and I do not intend to. Some debts, I've learned, are not actually debts at all. They're simply the price you paid, for a long time, to avoid finding out what would happen if you stopped. I know now. It cost me a family I'd spent 8 years believing in. It gave me one I actually have. There is a particular kind of contradiction at the center of my mother's story that took me the longest time to fully understand. She believed, all the way to the end, that she was the one being wronged. Not performing it, actually believing it, with the complete sincerity of someone who has spent a lifetime rewriting her own history until the rewritten version feels truer than the facts it replaced. That's not a simple villain. That's something more unsettling, a person who inherited a broken pattern, lived inside it without ever questioning its shape, and then genuinely could not understand why the child who'd been asked to sustain it might eventually refuse. The turning points in this story were never as loud as they felt in the moment. The 47-second phone call didn't end anything by itself, it simply removed the last layer of ambiguity I'd been hiding behind for years. And the confrontation at the bakery wasn't really the climax either, not in the way it might look from the outside. The real turning point happened quietly, weeks earlier, at 4 a.m, when I opened a spreadsheet I'd been avoiding for 8 years and finally let myself read the total at the bottom of the column. Everything after that was simply the slow, inevitable unfolding of a decision I'd actually already made. What this pattern teaches, I think, is something about the specific danger of love that only ever moves in one direction. It is possible to mistake constancy for connection for a very long time, to believe that because you keep showing up, the relationship must be real, without ever checking whether anyone on the other end is showing up back. I gave for 8 years because giving felt like the only language I knew for asking to be loved. I never once, in all that time, asked directly. I let a wire transfer do the asking for me, and a wire transfer cannot ask anything. It can only wait. My sister's unraveling wasn't justice, exactly, though it might look that way from a distance. It was simply what happens when a structure that was never actually stable finally loses the thing that had been quietly holding it up. I take no pleasure in it, but I no longer feel obligated to protect her from the consequences of a story she never bothered to question either. If there is a single thread that runs under everything in this story, it might be this: the people who raise us are not entitled to our resources simply because they raised us, and recognizing that distinction is not betrayal. It is, I've come to believe, one of the only honest forms of self-respect available to someone who has spent a long time confusing usefulness with belonging. I did not learn that lesson gently. I learned it in 47 seconds, on a phone, standing in a walk-in cooler with my breath turning to fog in front of me, and then, more slowly, over the better part of a year, in a spreadsheet, in a letter, in a hospital room holding my daughter for the first time. I don't know exactly what I would say to my mother if she called tomorrow. I've stopped rehearsing it, which feels, itself, like a kind of healing. If you've ever kept a ledger like mine, not on paper, maybe, but somewhere quieter, some running total of everything you gave and never once saw returned, I hope you eventually let yourself add it up. Not to punish anyone. Just to finally see the number clearly, the way I finally did, standing in that cold room with my breath fogging in front of me. The hardest part was never the confrontation. It was the 8 years before it, spent hoping I wouldn't have to have one at all. If any part of this reminded you of someone in your own life, a person you've been quietly holding up, a moment you already knew the answer to before you let yourself ask the question, I'd love to hear it. Drop one word in the comments, the name of what it cost you, or the moment you finally saw it clearly. And thank you, genuinely, for sitting with this story all the way to the end.